The official story is simple. Immigrants arrived at processing centers like Ellis Island, Castle Garden, and ports across Europe and the Americas. Their names were difficult to pronounce or spell. Clerks simplified them, a natural process of cultural assimilation. Nothing unusual, nothing worth investigating, except the timeline doesn't support that explanation. The name changes happened too quickly, too uniformly, across too many countries that supposedly weren't coordinating with each other. Start with a simple question. Why did so many countries implement formal surname laws within the same 30-year window between 1820 and 1850? The Ottoman Empire, 1826. Mandatory surnames for all citizens. Russia, various decrees throughout the 1830s and 1840s. Formalization of peasant surnames. Austria, Hungary, systematic surname registration in the 1820s. German states, standardization laws throughout this same period. And in America, the immigration processing system that would become famous for name changes began its formalization in the 1820s and 1830s, decades before Ellis Island even opened. This wasn't gradual evolution. This was coordinated reformation, and the deeper you look, the more it appears designed not to simplify, but to sever, to cut people off from their actual ancestry, to make genealogical research difficult or impossible beyond a certain point. That point curiously clusters around 1850, the same period when Tartaria disappears from maps, the same period when giant skeletons stop being reported in newspapers, the same period when the architectural narrative shifts from inheritance to rapid construction. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Before 1820, most European peasants didn't have fixed surnames. They used patronymics, place names, occupation names, that changed with each generation. Then, suddenly, within a single generation, everyone must have a permanent registered surname. The official explanation is administrative efficiency. Governments needed to track citizens for taxation and military service. Simple bureaucracy, but that explanation collapses when you examine which names were changed and which weren't across Europe and America. Certain categories of surnames were systematically altered, while others remained untouched. Names suggesting Tartar or Central Asian origin. Names containing specific root words that appear in old Tartarian place names. Names that suggested family connections to regions that were being erased from maps during this same period. These names were simplified, translated, or replaced entirely. Meanwhile, names of clear Germanic, Latin, or Anglo Saxon origin typically remained unchanged or underwent only minor spelling adjustments. The Ellis Island myth provides the perfect cover story. Millions of immigrants passing through a processing center where overworked clerks made mistakes or simplified difficult foreign names. It is believable. It is documented. And it is incomplete. Because the name changes weren't random errors. They followed patterns. Specific types of names were changed in specific ways, and the changes often resulted in surnames that obscured, rather than preserved, ancestral information. Consider what happened at Castle Garden, Ellis Island's predecessor operating from 1855 to 1890. Immigration records from this period show something peculiar. When families arrived together, sometimes only certain members had their names changed. A father might keep his surname while his sons received different surnames entirely. The official explanation attributes this to clerical error or individual choice. But the pattern suggests something more deliberate, as if someone was making decisions about which family lines needed to be preserved and which needed to be obscured. The deeper into immigration records anyone goes, the more inconsistencies emerge. Families arriving from the same village with the same surname often received different surnames upon arrival. The explanation given is pronunciation difficulty or clerk preference. But these weren't random variations. The changes often resulted in surnames that removed specific linguistic elements, prefixes suggesting nobility or land ownership, suffixes indicating geographic origin. root words connecting to pre-1850 place names that no longer appeared on updated maps. And here is what makes this impossible to dismiss as simple administrative error. The same patterns appear in countries that weren't processing immigrants. In Russia, the formalization of peasant surnames in the 1830s and 1840s systematically removed or altered surnames containing Tartar linguistic elements. Names were Russified, given Slavic endings, stripped of their Central Asian origins. This happened while Russia was simultaneously expanding into Siberia and Central Asia, claiming territories that old maps had labeled as Tartarian. The Ottoman surname law of 1826 did something similar. It required all citizens to adopt fixed surnames, but the implementation specifically targeted and changed names in Anatolia and regions that old maps had marked as Tartarian territory. The official narrative presents this as modernization, bringing the empire in line with European administrative practices. But the timing is suspicious. This happened precisely when European maps were redrawing borders and removing Tartarian labels from those same regions. In Germanic states, surname standardization laws in the 1820s through 1840s had a curious effect. Many surnames suggesting Slavic or Eastern origin were Germanized. The official explanation is cultural integration, helping diverse populations unite under common administrative systems. But the specific changes often removed elements that would have allowed genealogical research to trace families back to regions experiencing simultaneous cartographic erasure. What is missing from conventional historical accounts is the coordination. How did governments across Europe, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and America, all decide to formalize and standardize surnames during the same narrow window? These were rival powers, competitors, enemies in some cases. Yet, they implemented remarkably similar policies affecting family names during the same decades that maps were being redrawn, and certain historical narratives were being revised. The official answer is parallel development. Similar administrative needs led to similar solutions, but that explanation requires accepting an enormous coincidence. It requires believing that multiple empires independently decided to formalize surnames in ways that just happened to obscure ancestry from certain regions during the exact period when those regions were being erased from cartographic and historical records. There is another explanation. What if the surname changes weren't about administrative efficiency at all? What if they were about severing genealogical connections to a civilization that was being systematically removed from official history? What if the point was to make it difficult or impossible for future generations to trace their ancestry back beyond 1850, back before the reset, back to Tartaria? Look at what happens when modern genealogical research tries to trace family lines beyond the mid-1800s. The trail goes cold, not everywhere, not for everyone, but with suspicious frequency for families whose surnames suggest Eastern European, Central Asian, or Tartarian origin. The documentation becomes sparse. Church records are missing. Immigration records contradict each other. Family stories don't align with official documents. And the further back anyone tries to go, the more the trail fragments into inconsistency. This isn't unusual for genealogical research generally. Records are lost, destroyed, poorly maintained. But the pattern isn't random. The gaps cluster around specific time periods and specific types of names. Names that would have connected families to regions undergoing cartographic erasure. Names that would have suggested ancestry from civilizations being written out of history. The surname laws and immigration processing systems created plausible deniability. Of course, records are incomplete. People were moving, immigrating, seeking new lives. Of course, names were changed. Clerks were overworked. Immigrants wanted to assimilate. Of course, the genealogical trail goes cold around 1850. That is just the nature of historical record. Keeping every gap has a reasonable explanation. But when you step back and look at the pattern, when you see the same gaps appearing in the same time period across multiple continents for the same categories of surnames, coincidence becomes less convincing. Consider the missing church records. Throughout Europe, church baptismal, marriage, and death records provided the backbone of genealogical documentation for centuries. These records were carefully maintained, considered sacred, stored in stone buildings designed to last. Yet across Europe, a suspicious number of these records from pre-1850 periods were lost, destroyed in fires, or went missing during the mid to late 1800s. The official explanations vary. Wars, fires, administrative transfers that went wrong. Each incident has a documented cause, but the cumulative effect is massive genealogical blindness for specific categories of families in specific regions during the exact period when maps were being redrawn. The Austrian Empire experienced numerous church record fires and losses between 1820 and 1860. Russian Orthodox churches lost extensive pre-1850 baptismal records during the same period. German parish records from regions that would later become parts of different nations mysteriously vanished during territorial reorganizations. Ottoman administrative records from Anatolian regions were lost during modernization efforts. And in America, fires destroyed courthouse records, land registries, and naturalization documents with remarkable frequency during the mid to late 1800s. Each loss is explainable, but the pattern suggests something more systematic. Because the lost records disproportionately affected families whose surnames would have traced back to regions being erased from maps. Meanwhile, records for families with clearly Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, or other accepted Western European surnames often survived intact or were reconstructed with suspicious completeness. What makes this particularly disturbing is the timing. The surname standardization laws and immigration processing systems that changed names were implemented during the 1820s through 1850s. The church record losses and fires happened during the 1830s through 1880s, and the cartographic erasure of Tartaria from maps occurred during the 1780s through 1850s. Three separate processes, all affecting genealogical traceability, all occurring during overlapping time periods. If someone wanted to sever a population's connection to their actual ancestry, this would be the methodology. First, redraw the maps so the ancestral homeland no longer exists as a recognized entity. Second, implement surname changes that obscure genealogical connections to that erased territory. Third, ensure that records which might preserve those connections despite the name changes are lost, destroyed, or made inaccessible. The result is a population cut off from their true origins, unable to trace their lineage beyond a certain point, dependent on official narratives that don't include the civilization they actually descended from. The Ellis Island name change mythology serves a specific narrative purpose. It provides a comforting explanation for why so many people can't trace their family history beyond their immigrant ancestors. It attributes genealogical dead ends to bureaucratic incompetence rather than systematic policy. And it focuses attention on one location during one time period, rather than on the global pattern of coordinated surname alteration and record destruction. But Ellis Island opened in 1892, decades after the most significant surname changes had already been implemented. The real transformation happened earlier, during the surname standardization laws of the 1820s through 1850s, during the immigration processing at Castle Garden and other earlier ports, during the systematic Russification, Germanization, and Ottomanization of surnames across regions that were simultaneously being removed from maps as Tartarian territory. The immigration officers and government clerks implementing these changes probably didn't understand the larger pattern. They were following administrative procedures, processing people efficiently, standardizing records according to regulations. But the regulations themselves, the timing of their implementation, the specific types of changes they mandated, these suggest coordination at a level above individual bureaucrats. What is most telling is what happened to families who resisted name changes. In some cases, particularly in Eastern Europe and Russia, families who refused to adopt the new standardized surnames faced legal consequences, loss of property rights, inability to conduct official business. The pressure to change names wasn't just bureaucratic convenience. It was systematically enforced. And the enforcement was strongest in regions that old maps had labeled as Tartarian territory. The American immigration system operated differently but achieved similar results. Immigrants weren't legally forced to change their names, but the practical pressures were enormous. Employment discrimination against foreign-sounding names, social stigma, the promise of assimilation and opportunity, and the immigration officers themselves who often suggested simplified American versions of foreign surnames, following patterns that removed specific linguistic elements while preserving others. Modern DNA testing has created an unexpected problem for the official narrative, because genetic testing can trace ancestry in ways that surname research cannot. And what DNA testing increasingly reveals is that many families have genetic markers suggesting Central Asian, Siberian, or mixed ancestry that doesn't align with their family stories or their surnames. The official explanation is ancient migration patterns, genetic mixing that occurred centuries or millennia ago. But the frequency of these misalignments and their concentration in families, whose surnames were changed during the 1820 to 1850 period, suggests something more recent. If someone's surname is clearly German but their DNA shows significant Central Asian markers, the conventional explanation is that their distant ancestors migrated westward centuries ago. But what if the explanation is simpler? What if their surname was changed in the 1830s or 1840s during standardization laws that Germanized names from families, actually originating in regions being erased from maps as Tartaria? The resistance to comprehensive genetic testing of genealogical questions is notable. There is no systematic effort to correlate surname changes during the 1820 to 1850 period with DNA evidence that might reveal actual ancestral origins. Academic genealogy remains focused on documentary evidence, on tracing paper trails, on accepting the name changes as simple administrative evolution. Questions about whether the changes served a larger purpose of historical erasure are dismissed as conspiracy thinking. But the evidence doesn't require conspiracy in the sense of secret meetings and coordinated plots. It only requires coordinated policy implemented by governments that had reasons to obscure certain ancestral connections. Russia, expanding into Siberia, didn't want populations claiming Tartarian heritage. The Ottoman Empire modernizing didn't want administrative ties to pre-Ottoman political entities. European states consolidating power didn't want citizens tracing ancestry to civilizations outside the approved historical narrative. And America processing immigrants wanted populations that identified as Italian, German, Irish, not as descendants of an erased civilization. The surname changes served multiple purposes simultaneously. Administrative efficiency, certainly, but also genealogical severing, cultural assimilation, certainly, but also historical erasure. Each individual name change had a reasonable explanation. But the cumulative effect was millions of people cut off from their actual ancestry, unable to trace their origins beyond the mid-1800s, dependent on family stories that often contradicted sparse documentary evidence. What has been lost isn't just names. It is genealogical memory, the ability to know with certainty where families actually originated, what civilization they actually descended from, what happened to their ancestors during the period, when maps were redrawn and official histories were revised. The gaps in genealogical records aren't random, they're strategic, clustering around specific time periods, specific regions, specific types of surnames that would have revealed connections to an erased past. The truth is probably simpler and more disturbing than elaborate conspiracy. Governments during the 1820 to 1850 period had administrative, political, and ideological reasons to formalize surnames, process immigrants, and standardize records. Those same governments had reasons to discourage or prevent genealogical connections to Tartarian territory or heritage. So the systems they created served both purposes: efficiency and erasure, administration and amnesia. And now, generations later, the erasure is nearly complete. Most people accept that they can't trace their family history beyond a certain point. Most genealogists accept that records are simply incomplete. Most historians accept that surname changes were natural administrative evolution. The questions aren't asked because the answers would require reconsidering fundamental assumptions about recent history, about who built what, about which civilizations existed, and which were erased. But the surnames remember, even when we don't. The linguistic elements that survive standardization, the patterns in how names were changed, the gaps in genealogical records, they all point to the same conclusion. Something was being hidden. Ancestry was being obscured. Connections were being severed, and the coordination required to achieve this across multiple empires during the same narrow time window suggests the erasure was deliberate, systematic, and successful. Your surname probably isn't what you think it is. The family story about where your ancestors came from might be incomplete or incorrect, and the reason you can't trace your genealogy beyond the mid-1800s might not be poor record keeping. It might be that someone somewhere decided certain ancestral connections were better forgotten. Certain civilizations were better erased, and your family name was changed to make sure you'd never find your way back.